Recently, Autosport made a series of podcasts about motorsport's greatest cars. As we whittled down the list of true Grand Prix greats down to just one, the truly revolutionary Lotus 72, it was hard to find a modern machine that possessed all of the attributes necessary in order to overturn its reign as Formula One's greatest car. But Mercedes' all-conquering W11 could change the conversation. The W11 is without a doubt Mercedes' finest car yet. On occasions, a Mercedes W11 has been almost a full second clear, a truly astounding gap to the rest of the field, especially when you consider that the differences in lap time between each team are some of the smallest F1 has ever seen. Although F1 has become accustomed to Mercedes' dominance throughout the turbo hybrid era, the W11 has taken the team's advantage into the stratosphere. Its lead on raw pace in the early part of the 2020 season was around 1%, a gap not seen since the gizmo-laden Williams FW15C in 1993 during a less restrictive era. Although the car's 2020 livery, painted in black to underline Mercedes' socially conscious commitment to improving diversity within the team, is something of a sea change for the Silver Arrows, the car itself isn't too different from 2019's W10. It's almost the opposite of how Lotus went about business in its F1 tenure. Every year, Colin Chapman seemed engrossed in finding the next big thing. Indeed, the Lotus 72 might not have been quite so great had Chapman not been persuaded to give up his development of the 56B gas turbine car. Even though the W11 is strongly rooted in the W10's design convention, the car was conceived at the point during which Mercedes was starting to endure a lull in success during 2019. Between the 9th round of the season in Austria and the 15th in Singapore, Mercedes won just 2 races. Red Bull and Ferrari had taken the opportunities presented to them and picked up the other victories. The team used the challenge thrown down by Ferrari, then reaping the rewards of its controversial powertrain as an incentive to push the boat out with the W11 and include what designer John Owen describes as exciting developments to turn the tide, having been worried that a full-fat continuation of the W10 would not be enough to close the gap to the Italian team. The W10 was already pretty good, Owen says. We tried hard on that, and the W11 was, at the time it was conceived, at the height of us losing races. There were ideas we'd had sat around for a while which were pretty radical, and we decided that we're just going to do everything that we could. At the end of mid-2019 we said we can see the aerodynamic developments, the car's getting to dry up a bit, and we can forecast that forward into 2020. Do we think that that's going to be enough to close the gap? And we weren't sure it would be, so we decided we've got nothing to lose. We've got to go for everything we could do. Owen mentioned that when Ferrari was pegged back, Mercedes had a comfortable end to 2019. But then the realisation that the W11's upcoming projects had to deliver to keep Mercedes ahead. Although he says it was worrying at times, they all eventually worked out in the end. One of Autosport's criteria in selecting the greatest car was innovation. Much is made of the tight framework that contemporary F1 cars are designed to, and many consider the regulations too restrictive. But on the flip side, you could argue that the biggest driver in creativity is being able to take a tight set of regulations and find a way around them to develop a new idea. Pre-season testing at Barcelona was particularly memorable for that very reason. But first, if you're enjoying this video, it was originally written for the Autosport 70th Anniversary magazine, featuring 196 pages of exclusive features and interviews on the greatest cars, drivers, and stories from the past 70 years, including an interview with the 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton. Head over to the link in the description to pick up your collector's edition of the Autosport magazine today. Now it's back to the W11. Once Mercedes first activated its dual-axis steering system along the straight, when Lewis Hamilton pulled the steering wheel back to induce a shift in the car's toe, the mouths of seasoned journalists were left agape at the team's innovative streak. The reason behind that piece of ingenuity was to improve tyre warm-up, a weakness that Mercedes had identified as it lost ground in qualifying to the rapid pace of Ferrari's SF90 in 2019. By having a system that could move the tyre rub around more, the drivers could benefit from the tyres being well and truly within the temperature window by the time they hit the gas for an all-or-nothing qualifying lap. Owen explained that the new suspension layout was probably the most challenging aspect of the car. The team did have a backup for the DAS system with a standard steering rack in reserve, but he added, once you commit yourself to the rear suspension, you're a bit stuck. Mercedes also retained some of the rear suspension innovations seen on the W10, including the slot within the rear hub pickup point to improve its aerodynamic qualities. But it also borrowed the raised side impact structure positioning from its rivals down the grid, allowing the team to position the side pod inlets further up. This reduces the turbulence from the suspension from entering them, which can have an adverse impact on the mass flow rate of air passing through the radiators. The continuity of Pirelli tyres, which Owen says were the root of Mercedes' previous worries, meant that the team could spend time adapting the car to suit them. The Pirelli tyres are sensitive, that's been reported well enough. You can run into blistering, you can run into overheating, the teams are continually bouncing, and Pirelli are trying to make tyres for the fastest cars that there have ever been. I think the one thing that really helps to have fewer vices in the car is the tyres have been effectively carried over, and because they carry over, you have all of the learning you had in 2019. In testing, Mercedes immediately proved to be the class of the field. There was none of 2019's collar tugging when the W10 initially proved to be down on the Ferraris. 2020 looks set for Mercedes to take centre stage from the get-go. But still, there was work to do. Mercedes endured a few issues with its new power unit during testing, while the team had also planned new aero updates for the Dutch Grand Prix, scheduled for May. But then the world was brought to its knees by the COVID-19 pandemic, forcing Mercedes to completely reassess as the FIA-mandated factory lockdowns came into play. Owen explains that Mercedes decided to perform its lockdown as late as possible, giving the team time to finish work on the update package, then scheduled for the new season opener at the Red Bull Ring in July. Once complete, the team laid down its drawings, and at the end of the 9-week pause, the technicians could immediately pick them up and begin to produce parts for Austria. That first set of updates included new rear wing end plates and turning vanes on the chassis bulkhead, aimed at making small changes to the way the airflow was worked by the W11. Although slightly worried by a few glimmers of pace from Red Bull, Mercedes had plenty in hand over them at the Austrian Grand Prix, save for the drivers being asked to stay off the curbs in response to some sensor issues that struck mid-race. Since then, and barring the tyre issues that also gave the team a scare during the British Grand Prix, where Hamilton dragged the car to victory with a burst front left, and at the 70th anniversary Grand Prix where the harder compounds left the team struggling to work with the tyres, the W11 has been largely pitch perfect, especially in qualifying. Mercedes technology director Mike Elliott says, "If you take a look at the last 6 years, we've obviously had a car that's won the championship, but we've also had seasons where it's been termed a diva, or we've had races where we've been poorer." According to Elliott, there were seasons when the power unit was stronger than the chassis, and seasons where the reverse applied. He says, "I think this year we've got a car that, and the feedback from the track was, we couldn't really find anything to go and fix. The drivers were happy with what they got, the car really didn't have any vices. You have the usual ups and downs, but I think it's been a good car, and the guys trackside, under all of the pressures of coronavirus, have done an excellent job of delivering performance from it." The pandemic truly threw a spanner in the works for all teams, but Mercedes used the time away to perfect its W11. The team produced and maintained a dominant car while the world was in turmoil. The key question remains, however, is Mercedes W11 the new pretender to the title of F1's best ever car? It's been innovative, yet at the same time an evolution of an already great car, and it's dominated to a point where the other 9 chassis on the 2020 grid are deep in its shadow. With a few changes allowed for the 2021 season, the W11 is likely to continue winning for a second season too, another rarity in modern Formula 1. I would say, compared to our other cars, that this year has felt like it's had fewer vices, Mike Elliott says diplomatically. I think Red Bull boss Christian Horner described it in the press as the most complete car that we've ever produced. I probably agree with him. But another question remains, does the W11 have an Achilles heel? While Mercedes' 2020 Charger has proved to be the dominant force in F1 this year, it's not unbeatable. The gaps in its armour are small but exploitable, which Red Bull was opportunistic enough to pounce on during the 70th anniversary Grand Prix. Both Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas had suffered with tyre blowouts during the British Grand Prix, and with a softer grade of tyre primed for the second Silverstone round, Mercedes had another race of struggle to cope with. Team boss Toto Wolff suggested that the Mercedes had perhaps too much downforce for the softest Pirellis to cope with at Silverstone, where the loads on the left-hand tyres are high when dealing with high-speed corners such as Copse and Stowe. The W11 does seem to struggle when racing through the pack too. As the team is so accustomed to being out front, Hamilton and Bottas rarely have to follow any cards other than each other's, but Bottas has shown on a few occasions that any recovery drives usually hit a bit of a wall. But Mercedes almost had a far bigger weakness, the engine. Both drivers hit issues in pre-season testing, and Owen suggests that the team would have been in trouble had the Australian Grand Prix gone ahead. He says that engine was in a lot of trouble at race 1, and there was a problem they just struggled to find out about. They needed a day longer that they didn't have, but then the race season didn't start and they immediately managed to zero in on the problem. It would have been quite painful for us if that had been the first race, and we're quite fortunate. Now, we're in quite a good place. Whether the W11 will truly surpass the Lotus 72 as perhaps F1's greatest car, in our eyes at least, it will fall on next year and if it can retain its advantage. But one thing's for sure, the team won't rest on its laurels over the off-season. Owen concedes that it's the best car that Mercedes has ever produced, and in the context of future regulations, he suggested that the team will struggle to match its performance in the year to come. He says, it's a shame they've got the regulations next year to trim off performance because it was nice for them to get even faster. I think these are probably the fastest cars we're going to see in Formula 1 for a very long time. In his words, is it the best ever car? Well, it's certainly the fastest ever Mercedes.